All right. All right, students. So as promised, this is episode number 1 of our new history podcast. And we have with us today Dr. Stacey Graham. Dr. Graham, if you could just introduce yourself real quick for us, that would be great.
Sure. I work at the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University, and I teach in the Department of History here. I have a background in medieval history. I got my PhD from UCLA, and since then I have shifted my career focus a bit. I am now a historic preservationist, but I do teach classes on the Middle Ages still every now and then. And I take part in different scholarly events for Middle Ages scholars. And I always like to incorporate different primary sources and topics from the Middle Ages into my more general classes as well. I also spend a large chunk of my job working on a teacher professional development program with the Library of Congress that provides resources for K through 12 teachers that would help them with strategies and resources for using primary sources in the classroom for social studies.
Excellent, excellent. And what's the name of that program? Because
It's called Teaching with Primary Sources.
Okay.
And specifically Teaching with Primary Sources, Middle Tennessee State University, because there are several dozens of different programs and institutions that are running TPS across the country. It's a Library of Congress grant program.
Okay.
And because we want to disseminate primary sources from the Library of Congress website, it tends to focus more on American history topics.
Sure.
So unfortunately, I don't get to do enough medieval history when developing resources, but we've tried a few times. And there's always a way. The Library of Congress has, for instance, a really neat collection of medieval sailing chart maps.
What is it? Sailing?
I call them sailing chart maps
Okay.
because the real name is portolan maps. And so I'm just explaining that they were for navigational purposes while they were sailing. And so,
gotcha. Oh, sailing. I thought you meant sailing like a salt solution.
Oh,
It's
no,
like, what?
I have no
Gotcha.
idea what that would be. And I am not going to get into chemistry during this talk.
Gotcha.
Sailing, so navigational maps and some other things. So you never know what the Library of Congress has, but there are other really good resources for teachers who are teaching medieval history in the grade school level. And so I have a couple of those that I will probably mention during the course of this podcast.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that would be very helpful for me. I'll be checking into that for sure moving forward. So, well, I'm excited that you're here, given that you're an actual medieval expert, unlike myself. So, yeah, we have some questions here that I'd like to cover. So the first one is something that we talk about in my class a lot is and it's kind of a main like motif in my class is the effect of geography on history. So when we're talking about medieval European history, in your opinion, as an expert, what geographic features of the European continent do you think have had the greatest impact on medieval European history specifically?
Okay, well, I am going to start off by saying I think it's the Mediterranean Sea, but that's because of a couple of reasons. One is my particular emphasis when I was studying medieval history was earlier medieval history after the fall of the Roman Empire, when most of what we call civilization was encrusted around the coast of the Mediterranean. And of course, that's the lifeblood of networks of commerce, networks of trade, networks of communication during the ancient period, as well as the early medieval period. And it very much bound together all these different forms of culture that were transforming both on the Southern European continent, the Middle East, and North Africa. Because for a long time, places like Italy had more in common with places like, Western North Africa than they did with Northern Europe. But that's going to change during the Middle Ages.
Sure.
But another reason why I pick the Mediterranean Sea is because of the conceptual worldview that most medieval Europeans had up until Columbus, which was, if you look at a lot of these medieval maps, you don't really get accuracy in maps until the later Middle Ages, that what we can consider to be things we recognize as maps of the world.
Yeah.
But the conception of the world was with Jerusalem at the center and the Mediterranean Sea kind of separating this tripartite world system with Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then,
Sure.
of course, it'd be like a T, shaped like a T, with the T being the waterways, and then Jerusalem at the center.
Yeah.
And so that is a worldview that is going to be pretty cohesive during the European Middle Ages. So even when a lot of the institutional power of Europe turns northward, like after Charlemagne, and you see the emergence of northern kingdoms in the high and later Middle Ages. So you see more things focused on the North Sea. The Mediterranean is still incredibly important. And so I think that more than mountains, more than deserts, more than things like that, the waterways, of course, are the veins of communication and cultural transmission, and will remain so for most of this period.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was their highways in the absence of highways.
Well, and I mean, it's faster and it's cheaper to transport anything via water than it is via land up until the modern period. So
absolutely. Okay. Interesting. So let's if it's all right, let's kind of shift gears here and talk about one of what's always a fan favorite with the students, and that's the Black Death. Invariably we'll spend like a whole week on this every year because the kids just love talking about the gory stuff. So regarding something that I struggle with is, even now it seems like, depending on what sources you look at, the percentage of Europeans that died, that were affected by the Black Death, can vary wildly. So based on your knowledge and the latest knowledge, what is the most up-to-date percentage of Europeans that died from the plague? And then, like, if you could also talk about, what did people know? Because when this is sweeping across Europe, in their minds, what was happening, and what did they know? What did they not know about the plague?
Sure. Yes. I tend to do activities on the Black Death as well, because of course it's a fan favorite for my students too.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just one of those episodes in history that's endlessly fascinating, and now relevant in a way that it never was before, when we're all talking about plague and reaction to plague. And actually, I'm going to preface this by saying that I have consulted a friend of mine who is an expert in late medieval cultural history, and I pulled a lot of these answers kind of from her, because she does this, and this is a little bit out of my area of expertise. But yes, Dr. Carrie Banish at New College, Florida, teaches a class on the Black Death, and does a lot of interesting things with her students, and especially this past year, having them conceive of it as something that they themselves are a part of. But even today, among medieval scholars, these numbers are still very, very hard to pin down. And one thing that I've noticed is how interdisciplinary this has become for medieval scholars, because it is not just medieval history, because then you're really limited to the sources that you can work with. But I'm very amazed at how scholars who work on this topic are reading into epidemiology and modern biochemistry and just kind of like the medical aspects of it, and working with people who work with disease, that kind of thing. And so this is the way that a lot of medieval historians can come up with new interpretations, because somebody the other day said, oh, medieval history, isn't that just already been done? And I'm like, no, there are ways that you can uncover new evidence. Just because we may have quote unquote found all the written sources, which I don't believe to be true,
Sure.
but the Black Death is a great example of how you can use new evidence in other disciplines to shed light on the past and on a story that we thought we knew. But yeah, I read a book. I reviewed something that was written a couple, like 20 years ago, that was giving numbers like, well, if you have about 80 million people in Europe, then maybe 25 million of them died, which is a very high percentage. But this percentage will vary in different parts of Europe. And of course, it'll vary among different segments of the population. But now it seems like what scholars say today is 40 to 60%.
Wow.
Of mortality.
Goodness.
And one thing to note, though, is that the Black Death was not, it was not the first time this very specific bacillus raged through Europe. It's actually the second wave. The first wave was in the 6th century, 6th, 7th, 8th century, very well known for infecting the Emperor Justinian. And then it was dormant for several centuries, or at least largely dormant. These things are never fully gone away. And so its recurrence in 1347 in Europe is the second wave. And this is, thought to have originated in the steppes of central China and crossing Eurasia and reaching Europe around 1347 through merchant routes in the south, in like cities like Genoa, and reaching in parts of northern Europe by the early 1350s. And so this is a snapshot of hundreds of years of plague. So it's not like this is the only time in the Middle Ages that people were getting the plague, because there's actually going to be recurrence in the 1360s. And then about every 10 to 20 years up until the 18th century. I mean, this is the same plague that hit London in the 1660s that Samuel Pepys wrote about in his diary.
Sure.
And so this is not just a one and done. And so students need to realize that generations lived with this plague. And so if you're thinking about the impact on mentality and worldview, you might have people who lived through this in the prime of their lives, actually managed to survive, have kids, and then when their kids are young adults, they might be hit by this plague. And of course, the mindset is that this thing came from God. They obviously had no concept, nobody had concept of germ theory until like the 19th century. So trying to reach for what could possibly explain loss, catastrophic loss on an unprecedented scale. I mean, look at just the impact on mentality in the United States. And it's a very small percentage of people, even though it's a tragically large number, but a small percentage of people who are experiencing mortality, which is a very euphemistic way of saying they've died, of course. So sorry about that. But but yes, so, and the Black Death was preceded by years of plague, which may have actually weakened the population and their ability to fight this kind of disease 20 years later.
Sure.
So they were already starving across Europe, and people who managed to survive that are then hit with this gigantic plague. And then the survivors are hit by further waves of the same plague
Yeah.
for decades. It's just, you know, we really can't comprehend. And that's what the sources say. I'm sure that you have different text sources that you share with your students. You said they love the gruesome details
Right.
and all the wonderful pictures of the apocalypse and the dancing skeletons. So it really does change the way people think about death, and it impacts, you know, lay piety, which may not be a phrase that your students can define, but
Right.
basically it's you know, religious movements that are
Yeah.
not top down from the church. And
Because something, I assume something that is seen as coming from God, that's going to impact the population's view of God in a lot of ways.
right, like what can you do in the face of divine retribution, you know?
Mhm.
How do we atone for whatever sins have caused this?
Mhm.
And then when you think you've done that, it comes again later in your life
Over and
and
over and
keeps
over.
hitting.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, you get a lot of widespread scapegoating of different segments of the population that are already marginalized, such as Jews.
Right.
They're always your go-to scapegoats for European Christians in the Middle Ages, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and not just the Middle Ages, I should say.
Mhm.
And then in the early modern period, witches, you know, and other kinds of heretics. There's always going to be finger pointing because they just don't know how else to explain this, and they don't know how to treat it. Obviously, we look, you know, we they I think that they obviously recognize that isolation is a good way to try to stay healthy when you have in Boccaccio a party of 10 rich young people who have the means to escape to the countryside and sit this thing out. Um, and so
So they know
there's
there's
that.
something there.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
the sense of contagion, obviously. They
Yeah.
realize that this is something that spreads. They don't know how. And of course, nobody knew how it spread until the bacillus was identified by the guy after whom it's named. So it's
Mhm.
Yersinia pestis. Um, Oh, I should have brought
So,
my, I know your students can't see this, but I have a little, you can get a plushie bacillus of the Black Death from on the internet.
oh,
It's really
really? Oh,
great.
like is it the same one that John Green has in his crash course video, the little black fuzzy?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I believe it is. You can
Yeah. Yeah.
also buy your own coronavirus too. So
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure someone's capitalized on that very quickly.
it's a good way to get students
Yeah,
interested.
there you
So.
go.
And my
So
daughter loves it. She loves to throw it at me and say, I've caught the plague.
nice. She's gonna be a pun master, I can see.
Help me.
So go and if so you said earlier you mentioned the Justinian plague. So they think, it's my understanding that that was an early round of the same disease.
Yes.
So do they know what accounts for that, what is it, 800 year gap, where, because that was in the 500s, correct? And then it comes back in the 1300s, and it comes back with some regularity after that.
Yeah, yes. Well, actually, so the first wave would have occurred in about the 600s, and the second wave in the 1300s. There's actually a third wave that hit Asia starting in the 1800s. So you can see that these
Gotcha.
things are, I don't know
There,
why. I don't have an
yeah,
answer for
and
why.
we
Maybe
may
some
not.
people do, but it's,
It's lying dormant somewhere somehow, I
yeah.
assume, right?
But the second Black Death, that's, I mean, whatever. The bubonic plague is actually still with us because of the third wave, and it's here in America too.
Sure.
It's carried by rodents and stuff, particularly in places like the desert Southwest.
Yeah, I was about
So
to say, I know
still
I'm
get this.
originally from West Texas, and
Okay.
there's occasionally you'll hear stories of people, like I know there was a couple some years ago hiking outside Santa Fe, New
Yeah.
Mexico, that came down with it. You hear about it occasionally.
It kind of blew my mind when I learned that. I remember going to the CDC website and being like, what? Of course
Yeah,
we can treat it now because it's a bacterial infection,
sure.
um, as opposed to the viral infection of COVID, which is, obviously there's difference,
Yeah, yeah,
but one thing for your students also to keep in mind is they have lived through and personally witnessed not just a pandemic that's worldwide, but people's reactions, including seeing the medical profession trying to figure this out. And
mhm,
I know that there's been, you might hear people going, well, they didn't know if masks were going to be good at the beginning or not. I'm like, well, this is how science works. It doesn't know everything right away. It observes, it tests, it researches. Sometimes it takes time for preponderance of evidence to allow different conclusions that are more authoritative. And so your students have seen in real time the way that the medical professionals have been trying to figure this out.
mhm,
And it takes time. And
yeah,
even with like this unbelievably fast development of a vaccine, it's taken a year, and it's going to be a while before I get mine,
right,
and so like that long. And this is like with the best that modern technology has to offer. So we still don't know everything. We
right,
still have to figure things out. There have been a lot of really weird reactions and really inaccurate statements and a lot of very strange beliefs for how to counter this disease. So, we can't be throwing stones at medieval people for having all sorts of weird remedies for how
for
to
sure.
treat a disease that they had no means of just conceiving of,
Yeah,
because they had no idea about microscopic life
for sure.
forms.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hate to admit it, but I was just talking recently with uh, the young lady who was my student teacher last year. And during the Black Death, she mentioned, I had actually forgotten this, but she mentioned to me the other day that she remembered a student asking, and I vaguely remember this, a student asked what would happen if something like this happened in the modern day. And here we were 2 months away from, or a month and a half and away from the same thing happening. And we said something like, I don't, the scientific community would gather and figure it out, but the likelihood of that happening in the modern day is, with everything we know, is rather slim. And then
No,
now
no,
we're,
yeah,
yeah, and
that's
I'm,
the thing. We
that
need
was
to
an
be a bit
embarrassing,
humble here.
yeah, exactly, that was a
And
it,
it has tested our worldviews, and it has tested our ability to withstand abnormal conditions, and it has tested our ability to explain why things happen, and
mhm,
also to weigh risks and the concept of public versus individual health, and all these things. And it also shows that yes, there are going to be a lot of people, as an aggregate, reacting in a rational manner according to the latest scientific evidence, but there's also going to be a lot of emotional processing and irrational action and beliefs that come
sure,
out of this. It's just part of it, being modern, and this kind of emphasis on, oh, we live in a scientific age, but we still have a lot of different ways of processing these things that challenge us in our worldviews. I mean, in that way, we are kind of like medieval people.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So let's talk about change gears again a little bit. How, when we're talking about the life of an average European, so not our kings and our nobles, but the average person in medieval Europe, how did that change from, just after the fall of Rome till right before the Renaissance?
Oh my goodness.
I know this is a can of worms type question, but if we're going to
Well,
speak in like generalizations
yeah,
out of
I'll definitely
necessity.
speak in
Yeah.
generalizations,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
another thing you as a medieval history teacher knows is the year 500 to 1500 is 1,000 years.
Yeah. And we teach it in 6 weeks.
And it's like in American history, you might be like, oh, the Civil War as a
Mhm.
unit, and it's 4 years,
Yeah.
whereas the Middle Ages is 1,000 years. And so, diversity, there are so many things that are happening over very long stretches of time. And it's, yeah, so you're talking about a period that sees the growth of all these institutions that will be the foundation for modern institutions, such as church, monarchies, universities, bureaucratic government, towns, those kinds of things. Technological advances, you have the emergence of vernacular languages, a lot of different changes in agriculture. So if you're going to talk about the average person, you still need to mention some of these, because changes that take place in terms of landowning patterns and institutional organizations are going to be affecting your average population in terms of um, to whom they owe fealty,
Yeah.
what kinds of freedoms versus obligations do they have in their lives. And also technology has effects on the average population too. So one reason why the Black Death was in the 14th century was particularly damaging was because you had this steady population growth up to that point. And part of that was because the expansion of agriculture and agricultural technologies. You have the invention of the heavy plow in like the 9th century. You have other kind of minor advances, like the certain kind of yoke that you put on horses and oxen. These things make a really
Yeah.
big difference. Advances in like watermill technology and other kinds of things that allow for greater crop yields, and also the way people plant crops, moving to a 3-field system so that they can
Right.
rotate
Rotating.
better.
Yeah.
So all these things, they produce the kind of changes that are so incremental. It does take a couple hundred years to see these patterns. And so maybe like individual peasants wouldn't have realized that they were living through this the way they would have during the Black Death. But this is, so you have this steady population growth, and that also in turn ties into the growth of towns. So you have, this increase in this urban culture. And when you have a greater population and you have more people living in urban centers, you also have specialization of labor. So you have people who have more specific type jobs, and that points to these different markets and more people purchasing. And also that means a larger trade networks, and also I don't know details about this kind of thing, but advances in like financing and banking and consumer credit, that allows for these things to take place.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that's not really my area of expertise.
Mine
But
either.
also you have things like the invention of mechanical clocks, which I'm not saying that peasants would have clocks in their houses in the 13th and 14th century, but you would have a clock on a church. And so you know, all these little towns and villages centered around churches or maybe castles or maybe monasteries, but you know, you have this kind of large center of production around which you have all these services that are needed, and that's where you get towns. And then you throw a clock on a church, and we think of time as quantifiable because we quantify it. You know, you and I
Yeah,
met at 3 o'clock today. I could see it. It was on my computer. I
for
didn't
sure.
look at the sun. Of course, it's behind a cloud. But this whole concept of time and your time being regimented and no longer being marked by when the monks sang their different prayers, you know, and so this kind of puts people more into this, dare I say it, secularization of time,
Yeah,
and kind of is something that will grow into, will only become more important in the early modern period. So, you know, that, and as I mentioned before, this development of, or this evolution of the vernacular languages, and by, you know, you might have to explain to your seventh graders what vernacular means,
that's right.
but you know, obviously, at the fall of the Roman Empire, you have people speaking very localized regional dialects of their original languages plus Latin.
Right.
And then by the 15th century, you have amazing works of literature written in very distinct European languages. And so
Right.
those come from somewhere. And so this is the period that allows that to happen. Now, that's not to say that your average European peasant was reading these, but there's, you know, a lot of room under the word peasant. You know, it doesn't just mean poor person working in the mud.
Hmm.
You had a lot of very well-off peasants. It just meant they didn't have like a different status. You know, they
Sure.
weren't a merchant, they weren't a monk, they weren't a soldier. Um, but you had a lot of very well-to-do ones, and of course, literacy rates are still pretty low. But in order to participate actively in the economy, you do have certain forms of writing that have to be done. You know, receipt writing and inventories. And so you have a lot of that kind of ephemera. These are the kinds of documents that may not be as exciting or museum worthy, or at least they wouldn't have thought to have been that in the past.
Yeah.
But these are the documents of everyday lives where people are, you know, recording their businesses, and they're recording what they spend, and they're recording what they have and when they die,
Right.
and you know, what the children inherit. They're probably going to courts where these things are written down, and you know, maybe they can sign their name, so they're participating in written culture even if they're not producing written documents of their own. And so that's something that increases greatly. And then, I mean, think of it, by the end of this time period, in the 1450s, you have the invention of the printing press. I mean, you've already had paper introduced into Europe by like the 12th, 13th century. And so by the end of this period, we've gotten to this point where books are being produced in profusion, and not just books, but pamphlets, flyers, leaflets, again, this kind of ephemeral primary
Yeah.
source material that is more important to your general population than actual like thick books
Literature.
that we
Yeah.
see in libraries.
Mhm. Yeah, and that actually leads really, really nicely into my next question, which was about primary sources. And when you're doing research about medieval Europe, what kind of, so you kind of talked a little bit about some of the sources you use. So what other kind of sources do you use? And then I also wanted to tack on, when you're talking about those everyday sources, the I don't want to say I don't want to say boring, but the more average everyday, because you and I wouldn't think they're boring, maybe the students would, but those type of receipts and, bill of sale, death certificates, where do you, how do you track that kind of stuff down? Where do you go to find those sources?
Well, yeah, good question. Now, when I was in grad school, we went to libraries to look this stuff up. Nowadays, a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's amazing how much has been digitized in
Yeah.
just the 15 and a half years since I graduated. And so lucky for me, I got to go inside some really amazing libraries and call
Sure.
up actual books. But nowadays you can access so much more. Now, what I was looking at was a lot of theological texts. So I was looking at something that did not represent the wider swath of the medieval population, because I was focusing on monastic libraries, because that was my
Okay.
thing. So I
Gotcha.
like to use a lot of manuscripts in my classrooms, but I like to show how the change in the book format reflects all these changes in medieval society. So that's something I definitely try to hammer into my students, as my professors did to me.
Mhm.
And that is showing how the business class, the rise of the merchant class in like the 1300s, changed even the kind of handwriting people would use, the number of documents created, the format of books created, and the repositories. Because things like, bills of sale and inventories of furnishings and those kinds of things, those would be saved in secular archives, like at, your town center,
Mhm.
but sometimes the town center was the monastery. So these things would still be saved because they were legal documents, and they, would need to be accessed possibly in the future against possible court cases.
Sure.
And or they might be copied into a ledger that would then be saved as a record, and those would be but increasingly with the rise of towns, town charters were a very important thing for towns to have, that delineated their rights and what taxes they were responsible for collecting, and then what they were responsible for paying to whether it was the king, the abbot, the whatever.
Yeah. And
So
real quick on that topic, since you bring that up, that's something, the idea of a town charter. Can you just briefly explain to my
yeah,
kids
yeah, I'll do my
what that
best.
is?
Again,
And because I
I'm
always
thinking
struggle
about
with
all
this
my
every
friends
year.
who are so much better at this than I am. But anyway, like a town charter. So because most of medieval European life was based on land owning,
Mhm.
a few people owned land and most people had to rent it. And so towns developed, I mentioned before, around different centers of production, whether it was a castle or a monastery or a cathedral. And so towns would be granted certain privileges, like the right to trade in certain places, the right to have a fair every year. It would set the rate of taxation, and also state what the town was responsible for in the way of sanitation and public works, and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so it kind of is an offshoot of quote unquote feudal society,
Mhm.
which is based on the idea of obligations towards people who are higher up than you in the social hierarchy, and what your expectations are, what your responsibilities are, and what you get for that. And so
Okay.
these towns would be chartered, um, it's kind of like, I guess today, how you drive by and you see town signs unincorporated.
Mhm.
What's the difference between incorporated and unincorporated? It's just these little legal things,
Sure.
but it can make a big difference in terms of services that you get and taxation, and other kinds of things that you get in the category of where you fit. Um,
Okay.
so town charters are very important for the people who generally run the towns, like the burghers, like the trade guilds, and any kind of aristocrats who kind of invest and that kind of thing. You know, how much food the peasants have to produce to feed the monks in the monastery there, and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And but mostly by the end of the Middle Ages, taxation, it's so important. um,
Mhm.
and that's what keeps these towns running as today.
Gotcha.
So uh, those things, because they represent obligations, are very important to keep in case there's a dispute. And so you get more and more reliant on the written record to settle disputes, as opposed to, oh, well, the king's just going to, well, I mean, of course, you do have people presiding and then deciding and,
Yeah.
seeing the dispute through, but um, this idea that, well, there's an actual contract, as opposed to the intangible contract of custom. And of course, the famous example in England being the Magna Carta, which is when you have all these customary laws finally explicitly written out in the form of a contract,
Mhm.
when beforehand they were thought to have been, you have the weight of tradition behind it, which implies that everyone understands what that tradition is. And so now, instead of relying on the intangible, you have more tangible evidence to fall back on. And
Gotcha.
so it's important to save those things. And you have all sorts of different kinds of, my favorite word that I learned in grad school was a cadaster, which is a certain kind of record of different things. And I believe it was referring to Spanish towns, and there was a master cadaster, and I just thought that was the funniest thing ever. But it was a very important source for a friend of mine writing his dissertation about, this kind of region, what the town's activities were. um, and you wouldn't believe it, everything. uh, People never, even people who lived out in the countryside, they didn't do anything in isolation. You don't grow, you're not really self-sufficient. You trade, you barter, you get protection, you go to the church, you get married, all these different things leave a record, just like they do today.
Right.
um so yeah,
So
it's
that
a very important treasure trove of primary sources that are extant in various forms of preservation, depending on
I would imagine, yeah.
whether they've lasted the test of time. A lot of things, were stored places where there were fires. There were lots of fires,
Yeah.
or things that got bombed in the 20th century wars, or things that just succumbed to mold in a cellar somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's
Leaky
just,
leaky roofs and all kinds of fun stuff.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
just pretty amazing we have as many things as we do. Apart from the more kind of institutional texts and theological ones that would have been saved in like the great monastic libraries and later the great university libraries, which is kind of like what I
Yeah.
like to study. So
Sure. Sure. So how do you, as a professional, how do you combat bias in when you're looking at these various sources? Because that's another big
mm,
topic in seventh grade is how to, not just take things at their word, but you have to do
oh,
that
right.
deeper level of examination, and we're still learning how to do that. So what tips do you have, and like how do you do that?
Yeah, my students are still learning how to do that too
It's
at
hard. Yeah, it's
MTSU.
hard.
So it's a lifelong thing. We all
Sure.
need to recognize our own biases whenever we read anything. Um,
Absolutely.
I actually find that it might be easier for primary sources in the Middle Ages because they're so far removed from our own time and our own experience that it does seem like more of a different world, even though we do like to make connections and have people relate. But the danger comes with recent, primary sources from just 50 to 100 years ago in America, where it's a lot easier to approach those and think, well, I know how this person was thinking. And
Mhm.
the agendas are more easily hidden, and the bias is something that may be harder to detect because we're closer to it. And
Mhm.
so I think that in some ways it's easier to see the bias because some of these medieval sources just sound so strange when you read them. I liked to study a lot of saints' lives, which
Okay.
of course were it's a genre that was never meant to be the same as investigative journalism is today,
Mhm.
So my students read them and they're like, this is ridiculous. This didn't happen. This person didn't fight with a demon in a cave, they didn't stand in a cold stream for 20 hours on end and have a magical bird come and land on them. It's like,
Yeah.
so in a way, it's kind of alien to them, but then they want to throw it out because there's this sense that, well, if it's not true, then it's not valuable. And that is so missing the point of medieval sources. I mean, yeah, maybe like a town charter that we were just talking about would be more objective, to use a completely anachronistic term.
Mhm.
Um, but when you're looking at other sources from the Middle Ages, you need to consider them as a special window into a different mindset. So there are many different levels of translation that these things have to go through. So for one thing, I like to do, especially because sometimes I teach ancient history, and so I'll teach um, like Thucydides, an ancient Greek writer,
Mhm.
and then I'll have to explain all the different steps that this original work had to go through in order for them to be reading it in modern English today. And it's
Yeah.
astounding. I don't think people think about that.
Yeah.
Not just translation from one language into another, but how has it lasted? How many times was it copied?
By
How many
hand.
times was
Yeah.
one copy pieced together from different pieces here and there to get the fullest version we could of something that is still not complete? And then having to do the mental translation of, oh, these people have a different worldview, um and that's a lot harder to uncover. So I
Yeah.
think just trying to look at these sources as a window to another world. What does it say? And not be judging it based on how we would read something written in the 20th century. We can't be going in and expecting these people to be writing in a modern way.
Yeah.
And we only know what we know because it was preserved by people in the Middle Ages. And so, what led them to preserve this? Was it accident? Was it on purpose? What would it have meant to them that we can figure out? And, how are we going to put our interpretation on it now, knowing that that has also changed over hundreds of years? So we are in a tradition of looking back hundreds of years and trying to figure out what we can. But I think they should really approach it with a sense of wonder.
Yeah.
I find things very just I don't want to say charming because that sounds kind of condescending, but just wonderful to read,
Yeah.
because I'm like, wow, what kind of worldview allows them to just imagine the hand of God in so many different physical senses and not just in a spiritual sense.
Yeah.
And, that's why I like to read about monks.
Yeah. For sure. No, I love that because I hadn't thought about it like that. In that, like, you're right that we in the 21st century almost want to read everything in this like kind of objective, uber objective, like scientific almost sense, and that's just not like you were talking about earlier with the plague. They didn't understand the plague that way, so they wrote about it in a different way because they weren't looking at it scientifically. So that's interesting. Excellent. Um, so two more questions here, if you still have time. I don't want to take up
Sure,
too
absolutely.
too much of your time here. Um, so what what do you not remember learning about when you took medieval? And I'm sure as knowing what you know now, I'm sure there's just a laundry list of uh, of stuff here. But what did you not learn about in medieval European history in primary school? If you could maybe pick one or two topics
Oh,
that you
well,
wish you knew.
Mr. Stevens, I have a confession. I don't remember anything
You
from,
can, okay,
and I was trying to think about it
yeah,
earlier. Like, I remember 8th grade social studies class. I remember the teacher's name. I remember what we learned.
yeah.
I, for the life of me, cannot remember anything about 7th grade social studies
You mean that
at
your
all.
you mean that your 12-year-old brain didn't just soak up everything perfectly?
But I remember other classes from 7th grade. I remember the poem I memorized for English class. So,
Interesting.
but also, I don't think that at that time we were studying the Middle Ages in 7th grade,
Sure.
because this would have been in the Rutherford County school system in the late 80s.
Okay.
And I'm sure the curriculum has changed enough over the years, and I can't say what it was that we were learning at that time in 7th grade. Maybe it was geography, or, at that time, I
Yeah. I'm
I
sure it's
don't know.
changed.
Like
I'm
I
sure it's
said,
changed 30 times since then.
yeah, I have a weird just void in my brain. Apologies to whoever my teacher was back then. But I don't remember. Okay, I do remember in high school taking a world history class, and there must have been some medieval history in there somewhere. I didn't
Mhm.
actually take what I feel like was a real medieval history class until college,
Sure.
but I knew I liked the Middle Ages for some reason. I think it was just things that I read on my own.
Mhm.
Um,
Something led you to study it in
it was
in
probably Lord of
college
the
somehow.
Rings.
Okay. Yeah. Being honest, I like it.
I was
So
probably Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
I got you.
I have to admit, that's probably
Okay.
why I became a medievalist.
Hey, whatever got you
Oh
there
yeah,
is
whatever inspires you, kids.
absolutely. So let me maybe posit the question a different way then. Like how, so
Okay.
you're pretty in your work. My understanding is that you're pretty familiar with the seventh grade standards, at least
Yes.
at least roughly.
Mhm.
So what do you feel is not in the standards that should be?
Well, I kind of feel off the record that there's way too many things in all of the standards, and that we need to be doing this in a qualitative rather than quantitative way.
Mhm.
One thing I like about the 7th grade standards is they do have a global aspect, and that's definitely a really big trend in medieval studies today, is the global Middle Ages. And
Mhm.
that's where I'm going to actually mention one of the links that I mentioned to you earlier. Um, there's another program in California that works on this Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. It's the California History Social Studies Project, the Social
Okay.
Sciences Project, so the CHSSP. And they created a whole unit on medieval history called Sites of Encounter in the Medieval World. And so if you just Google it, and
Sites
I
of
can I
encounter.
can
Okay.
send you the link afterwards in an email,
That
Mr.
would be
Stevens.
great. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Because they think about the Middle Ages as in a global sense, which our current Tennessee standards do. But one thing that they do better is they, instead of moving from like, okay, now we're going to do Africa, now we're going to do India, now we're going to do China and Japan, and now we're going to do Europe, as if they're all piecemeal. And I know it's really hard to organize these things, and I really don't want to criticize people who have that really rough job. But one thing that the Sites of Encounter unit does is it picks places like Calcutta or Venice, and it'll, through a few primary sources, talk about all the different cultural intermixing that was going on in these places, what trade routes met there, what different events happened, like is this a site of a crusade or that kind of thing. And so it, through these different case studies, it gives you the idea of the interconnectedness of all these different places. That's not to say that things were all as globally minded on the average person level as they are today, but still a lot more than people think was taking place. And of course, especially with trade routes and stuff, by the time you get to Columbus, they were very well able to map the world. Of course, they had to go from the Copernican map to the map based on Amerigo Vespucci. But that happened in the space of like 10 years. They had already, we have a whole extra half of the world here. But so this sense of the world that just exploded was not from nowhere. There had been cultural interactions for centuries. And you just have to look at the Byzantine Empire to see how many different times it was overrun or in contact with all these different Eastern religions and groups.
Yeah, that is always that's one of my biggest struggles, is how to teach these units that seem so isolated, and then somehow explain that each of these like all this stuff we've been talking about all year, these people were often in contact with one another and intermixing and trying to get across some idea to students about various things that were going on at the same time. Like while we're talking about the Byzantine Empire, this is what was happening in China at that time, and this is what was happening in West Africa, and so on and so forth. It's that is very difficult.
Well, it's extremely difficult, and so that's why I like the idea of doing it through like little case studies or examples. Like, how did paper get from its invention and China to the Islamic Arabic world of the Middle East, then through Islamic Spain to the Jewish and Christian scholars there, and then through there to Europe. And so even like an example like that, I think can get students thinking about networks in a way that, just kind of a generic textbook passage may not help them remember.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So last question here. Why should an American 7th grader in 2021, why should they care about medieval Europe? Why it can seem so distant to them? How in your, I just kind of want to hear your perspective of why this is important, because that's another struggle, is trying to convince them that they should care, because I believe they should. So make your case.
There's a fun answer and a non-fun answer, and the fun answer is it's just cool.
Yeah.
And it's cool. And then I should add another kind of answer, which is the boring answer, which is this is the time period that kind of sees the solidification of these institutions that will be in place for modern Europe. But then the not fun answer, which I kind of talked about with you before, is that I teach a classical history class here at MTSU, which is ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then sometimes I get to teach medieval history as well. And this past year was the very first time that I ever felt like I had to start my class with a disclaimer that a lot of people with malicious agendas misuse the ancient and medieval past to serve their own malicious cultural and political agendas today. And by that, I mean white supremacists who look to the European Middle Ages as this kind of pure culture for pure Europeans before any kind of diversity sets in.
Yeah.
And for one thing, that's not accurate, as scholars have shown again and again. It also foists this very anachronistic idea of what purity is onto the past in a way that's just not helpful for anybody.
Yeah.
And this idea that whatever culture a people might have had in a certain place in the Middle Ages, there's no way that it was the same over wide geographical swaths.
Sure.
There's no way that it was the same and untouched and unchanged through hundreds of years to be handed down to us in this pure form now. That's not the way history works. And yes, we do have a legacy where a lot of our institutions, beliefs, religions, cultural traditions come from the Middle Ages and through the Western Middle Ages, the Greco-Roman past, but that's a little bit looking at the past with blinders on because you're just looking at one part, and this idea that there is a white culture at all for white people is a total construct. There is no such thing. And that's like saying that all of Africa is Black culture and it's a monolith, and that is absolutely not true. And so I know a lot of people think that by projecting diversity into the past, you are being anachronistic and using your 21st century neoliberal agenda to diversify the past and take away from us, but that's I mean, maybe some people go a little bit overboard and do that and talk about, well, there was just diversity all over the place all the time. But this is where focusing on primary sources and widening your scope of inquiry into different places will really just let these sources speak for themselves. But then again, primary sources never speak for themselves, which is why we have history.
Yeah.
Because historians interpret primary sources, and so historians speak for primary sources, but your students can become those historians.
Absolutely.
And they can speak for the primary sources. And so basically just, I would caution students about the use and abuse of the medieval past. I mean, that's why Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, because some medieval source said that that was a Germanic area and therefore it belonged to Germans, even though the Germans of the early Middle Ages were totally not the same as the Germans of the 20th century. So I would caution them to be skeptical and to try to find these things out for themselves. And they have the power to go to the source and read it without going through filters of the internets. But at the same time, there has been, 100 years of solid medieval history scholarship that is being added to every single day. And I follow so many medieval scholars on Twitter, and I respect them greatly. They're doing what I once hoped to do. And you should definitely listen to experts as well. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. But at the same time, you need to understand how historians come up with their versions of the past. And
it's almost under the understanding that, and it's not just students do this. It seems like more and more nowadays, everybody wants to do this, and it's frustrating in a lot of ways, but also understandable that people want to get out their broad brush for everything and just oversimplify everything, whether it's history or politics or whatever. Um, and what I hear you saying is that understanding that there's such a deep level of nuance and complexity and
Absolutely.
in history the same as with anything else.
Well, and I know that nuance and complexity might make your students care less about it, or maybe it'll put them off. But like
Makes
I
it more
said,
interesting.
I started with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which
Mhm.
is totally not historically accurate, and it's just really simplified and, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, I had students who were interested in Rome through Assassin's Creed. There are so many things out there now, even Game of Thrones,
Yeah,
which I love, but anything in popular culture, or even things that you read about on whatever sketchy website you might be on, just ask yourself, oh, where did this come from? Why is this here? Why is this portrayed this way? And you might find yourself in the most fun rabbit hole that you were ever in. And there are actually better and better books written by scholars about medieval history for um, like middle and high school level students,
hmm,
because there is a greater understanding in the academy that medieval history professors don't just need to speak to each other or their graduate students,
yeah,
but they do need to work with K through 12 teachers
hmm,
who also teach medieval history
for
and
sure.
help them. And so I see a lot more reaching across and out of the ivory tower, and there are lots of scholars doing very good work to make sure that students before they get to college can have a great experience learning medieval history, because
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
it is. It is. And it's really encouraging to hear like you said, the reaching across from discipline to discipline. Um, off the top of your head, and if you don't know, that's perfectly fine. But off the top of your head, do you know, are there some titles specifically that you could recommend? And if not, you can email
Well,
me or.
I don't know the exact name, but I do know that I had heard about one of these such books being written for younger audiences, either edited by or partially written by William Chester Jordan, who is a very prominent medieval scholar, um,
Okay.
who is one of the very established people in his field, who could go on, teaching to grad students all he wanted, but he sees the importance in reaching out to younger K through 12 audiences and their teachers. So I will look up that specific title and I will email that to you.
That'd be
And
great.
there's one more thing too that I wanted to mention.
Mhm.
Princeton has just created a website called Middle Ages for Educators. And
Excellent.
there's not a whole lot of stuff on it right now because it's pretty new, but there are some videos where um, scholars are talking to younger audiences, either to, teachers such as yourself or, your students, about like one, very focused topic. But for instance, I actually wrote a lesson plan on the Black Death last year in one of our newsletters, and I linked to a video where Dan Smale, who is a Harvard professor, is
Mhm.
talking about this woman whose father died in the Black Death, and he shows the court document where she comes in and tries to, she has to report his death, but she's late because of, it's been a year, it's
Yeah.
been a crazy year.
Yeah.
And he gives a little context, and it's really neat. And it only takes like 12 or 15 minutes. So it's something that you could fit into your classroom. So they have videos like that. And that's Middle Ages for Educators from Princeton. And I
Excellent.
will send you the link to that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. These are the kind of things that I'm sure if I spent the time looking on my own, I would happen across, but
Well,
time
that's
is
the
a
thing.
valuable resource.
Yeah, one of the things that we do with teaching with primary sources is we know that you guys are slammed. And so if we can save teachers time by finding resources and vetting them and saying this is a good one, then that's part of our job.
Yeah, and we appreciate it more than any of you would ever know. For sure. Well, Dr. Graham, thank you so much. Seriously, this has been great. I know the kids will just eat this up.
Well, it's
It's
been
been
my
really,
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna, if you would stay on for just 1 second, I'm
Sure.
gonna stop the recording here.